What is this? Now, you might look at that and...
It's an electric guitar.
Yes, I bloody know that! But what is this? I mean, obviously, it's an electric guitar, but what kind of electric guitar? You've seen them in movies. You've seen them in TV shows. You've seen them in the hands of absolute beginners and in the hands of the very best. You've seen them hung brand new in guitar stores, but you've seen them hung used in the halls of some of the most high-end collectors in the world. To the untrained eye, you might just say, it's an electric guitar. A fair observation. But this design is so iconic, so ingrained in pop culture, that its design has withstood 70 years of time and development in the guitar industry. So, to answer the question for those with the untrained eye, the name of this electric guitar is... Ah yes, the Fender Stratocaster, the lost object of guitar players for the past 70 years. It's the guitar you probably started on. It's the guitar that you strive towards. Every guitar player has at some point owned or dreamed of owning a Fender Stratocaster. But why do guitar players still go for a Fender Stratocaster? This year marks the 70th anniversary of the Fender Stratocaster's first release in 1954, and despite the design barely changing over the past 70 years, it's still remarkably one of the most successful guitars in the current guitar market, as well as the most successful guitar model of all time. This documentary intends to answer this question: why do players still buy Strats? Why do players still want Strats? To do this, we will look over its vast history, its controversies, its highs and lows. We will be speaking to new guitar players who play Strats. We will be speaking to experienced guitar players who play Strats. And even still, we will be talking to the very people who sell you those Strats to find out just why this is the most successful guitar ever built. Welcome to the Fender Stratocaster, 70 years on.
So, if we're going to talk about the history of this guitar, we need to go a bit further back than 1954. In fact, let's talk about some facts of life. Water keeps us alive, the grass is green, and the Pope doesn't exist. But do you know what is another fact of life? Guitarists want to play loud. So, you want to play loud, and it's the early 20th century. How do you do it? Well, you have an acoustic guitar, and that's really it. I mean, you could, for instance, mic up an acoustic guitar, that makes it slightly louder. And as well as that, there was a small invention called the pickup, to pick up the vibration of the strings and put it through an amplifier, which makes your guitar louder. However, guitarists had a small issue with this. As much as it made their guitar louder, it also caused a rather nasty side effect called feedback. Caused a massive problem for the guitarists of the early 20th century, and there wasn't really any way of dealing with it when every guitar is a hollow body guitar. So, there needed to be a solution. But thankfully, like all good solutions, it came in the form of one man who wanted to listen to strings. This man was Les Paul. Les Paul is an inventor, as well as a professional jazz musician. Not only was he very popular in the mid-20th century, he was also responsible for inventions such as tape delay. However, one invention he is mostly accredited to is the invention of the solid body electric guitar. You see, this was a big innovation because hollow body guitars picked up the sound of the strings, resonated them within the body, and that's what you heard. But Les Paul thought, what if I got rid of that and simply wanted to hear the sound of the strings?
To achieve the desired sound of the solid body electric guitar, Les took on developing and experimenting with certain materials, one famous example being a piece of rail. Eventually Les would settle on wood, a 4x4 piece of wood with an Epiphone neck bolted to it, as well as Les's own little invention, the humbucking pickup, which was not patented until the 1960s by Gibson. Another thing that Les would add onto this guitar is a tremolo, something that would not be standard on guitars until around the 1950s with the introduction of Bigsby tremolos. With all of these aspects come together, Les had inadvertently created a guitar that would change the guitar markets for the foreseeable future. This guitar was called the Log.
So, Les Paul designs the first solid body guitar, the Log. And he thinks, this is a great idea. I'm going to take it to a company I have been working with pretty closely, Gibson. He takes it to Gibson and, well, Gibson don't like it because it is essentially a plank of wood with halves of a guitar glued to the sides. So, didn't exactly go over well. But Les Paul happened to be next door neighbours to someone who was interested in a bit of innovation. A man called Leo Fender.
Clarence Leonidas Fender, better known as Leo Fender, would found K&F Manufacturing with his friend Doc Kaufman, who had worked previously with the company Rickenbacker. K&F would be best known for its time of making radios, amplifiers, and Hawaiian guitars, better known today as lap steel guitars. Doc Kaufman would leave the company in 1946, where in 1947 the company was renamed to Fender Manufacturing, later Fender Musical Instruments.
One day, Les Paul meets up with Leo Fender at his house and shows Leo the Log. And Leo takes quite a liking to it, thinks it's a great idea, and even offers to go into business with Les to create a full production solid body electric guitar, to be called the Fender Les Paul guitar. Well, that's a timeline we will never see, because though Les did consider it for a short while, he eventually declined, hoping eventually to work with Gibson, and well, if you know anything about guitars, you know how that turned out. So, Les Paul declined the offer, but was perfectly fine with Leo Fender taking the idea, making his own solid body electric guitar and putting it into production. So, by 1950, Leo did just that. But it wasn't the Strat. It was this. This is a Fender Telecaster, the first ever production solid body electric guitar.
Originally released in 1950, the Fender Broadcaster, as it was then known, was one of the first solid body electric guitars to ever be mass produced. As you can imagine, this was a revolutionary design for its time. A one-piece ash body with a one-piece maple neck, a whole cutaway on the body, 2 Fender patented coil pickups, 3 brass saddles, a volume, a tone, a 3-way selector switch, and 6 Fender inline tuners, a design that has stuck with Fender since its very beginning. That man just stole my tripod. Upon its initial release, though welcomed by some, the Telecaster was seen as niche, to say the least, with some very unfavourable reviews, some even calling it a canoe paddle, some even calling it a shovel. However, when in its first 2 years of production, the Telecaster was beginning to become successful, gaining favour with quite a few musicians around the California area. In fact, it was becoming so successful that Gibson started to recognise the Fender Telecaster as a genuine competitor in the market, as such taking up Les Paul on the offer of creating his own solid body electric guitar in 1952 with the ever-famous Gibson Les Paul.
So, the Telecaster, upon its initial release, was a success. I mean, a solid body electric guitar. It's new, it's innovative. But Leo Fender wanted to take it further. Because Fender at the time was still a relatively small business localized in California, Fender managed to work closely with local musicians to test their new products, and the Telecaster was nothing different. Fender would take these guitars to the local musicians and ask them what could be changed about it. Now obviously the Telecaster was a success, and obviously not many changes were wanted to be made to this, but guitarists wanted a slightly different guitar. You see, you might look at this and you think, looks a bit boxy, doesn't it? Well, that's exactly what Bill Carson had a problem with. He wanted contouring on the body so it better fits against his body while he's playing. So, Leo Fender takes these changes and ideas that come from local musicians about the Fender Telecaster and goes to work in, well, slightly changing it to create a new model. That model resulted in this, the guitar of the hour, the Fender Stratocaster.
The Fender Stratocaster would feature very similar specs to the Fender Telecaster. For instance, it would both have a 25.5-inch scale length, it would both have Fender patent coil pickups, and would still have the 6 inline tuners. However, new design elements were added. An extra pickup, an extra tone knob, even an extra cutaway.
Another cutaway.
Wow,
Look at that.
an extra cutaway.
That's amazing. I like that.
But there were still design elements that were added to the Fender Stratocaster that would change guitar manufacturing forever. For instance, Bill Carson's idea of adding contouring to the body. This was a new idea and was implemented on the Stratocaster quite well. Another element was the synchronized tremolo system. You see, up until this point, tremolo systems were initially just bolted onto the body. They didn't sit flush with it, and one of the biggest issues was they would go out of tune if the tremolo was used heavily. The Fender synchronized tremolo system was fitted directly to the body, almost flush with it. It didn't take up the entire front of the guitar either. And it was bolted in using 6 screws with 6 adjustable saddles, both forwards and backwards and up and down to adjust the height. As well as this, had a cavity around the back where 3 springs were mounted, so it allowed for a smoother tremolo effect while not being at all cumbersome around the rest of the body.
So, the Fender Strat, though a success today, didn't exactly get off to an amazing start. It was niche, it was new, it was futuristic. That was until it got in the hands of famous musicians. One of the first famous names to play one of these was Buddy Holly, in 1957 playing one of these on the Ed Sullivan Show to perform his new song, Peggy Sue.
If you knew Peggy Sue, then you know why I feel blue without Peggy.
Sooner after, in the 50s, we begin to see guitarists like Hank Marvin play one of these, and Cliff Richard and the Shadows. And then, soon after, these famous guitars found themselves in the hands of one of the most famous bands in history, the Beatles.
I've got a dog, he's called Fred. My dog is alive, he's not dead. I love my dog, he loves me too. I haven't got...
Within the first decade of its existence, the Stratocaster had become an international success. Well, just about. In the 1950s, there was a law in the UK prohibiting the import of certain products from America, which included guitars. However, this didn't stop British guitarists longing after the Fender Stratocaster, as American broadcasting was still occasionally shown in the United Kingdom, including the famous Ed Sullivan performance of Peggy Sue by Buddy Holly. By the beginning of the 1960s, the restriction on American import products, including guitars, was lifted, and though that these guitars were now allowed in the UK, they were still considered quite rare at the time. However, the want for Fender Stratocasters was furthered by an American guitar player who had just recently moved to the UK in 1966. This man was Jimi Hendrix. This first decade of the Strat was successful, and the Strat saw little to no change throughout its time, despite, however, there were some certain changes made.
Within the first 10 years of the Stratocaster's existence, there was already some small, minor changes being made. One of the largest being in 1959, when the fretboard was changed to a rosewood slab board. And so, within the first 10 years of its existence, the Stratocaster is recognised as an international success, with many famous professional players playing these live on stage. And that's it. That's the story and the history of the Fender Stratocaster. Or is it?
The years following its first decade of success marked dark times ahead for Fender. A period of controversy, of poor quality control, of headstocks that some people think are slightly too big. But how could this be? How could this ruin the image and reputation of one of the most reputable musical instrument manufacturers in the world? This omen, this curse upon Fender, would become known by 3 letters: C, B, S.
So, if you were to go to a vintage guitar collector and ask them, what are the best Fenders ever made? They would probably say something along the lines of 54 to late 65, or they would even call it pre-CBS. But what does pre-CBS mean? Well, in late 1965, Leo Fender sold Fender Musical Instruments to CBS, the American broadcaster, who at the time was buying up quite a few instrument companies. You see, CBS, upon purchase, began making some changes to Fender guitars, in particular the Stratocaster being the flagship model of the time. It started off relatively small, with only the decal on the headstock here being changed to a slightly bigger one. But then they made the headstock bigger, and then they made the logo bigger. You might think of this as such a mundane change, but for the players, this was utter hell.
Initially, the design choice to make the headstock and the logo bigger was apparently due to marketing. An understandable change. However, a bigger issue loomed on the horizon. That issue? Monopoly. Sadly not the board game, but like the board game, this decision might make you angry, make you sad, or make you want to go to A&E because you've accidentally swallowed one of the houses. What was the basis of this decision? Capitalism. Monopoly. Noun. The exclusive possession or control of the supply of or trade in a commodity or service. You might recall I mentioned CBS was purchasing other instrument companies at the time. Apparently, this was in an attempt to extend their reach beyond just television. You see, CBS also had their own division of music production, Columbia Records, which at the time had some of the biggest artists of the era. Bob Dylan, Johnny Cash, Miles Davis, The Byrds, Simon and Garfunkel, Santana and Janis Joplin, just to name a few. So, let's say in this situation, you are CBS, and you have a music production division, Columbia Records, working with some of the biggest artists of the time. And finally, you have just purchased multiple different musical instrument manufacturers. So, you give those artists those musical instruments. Those artists go on to make records with those musical instruments, go on to perform live with those musical instruments. Even outside of being broadcast on your broadcasting service, they are playing your musical instruments. people watch these people on your broadcasting service or on someone else's broadcasting service or even live, and they're seeing these musical instruments and thinking, oh, I would love to have one of those. I'm going to buy one right now. You make a profit from these people merely playing your instruments. However, there is a downside to all of this. Once again, coming back to that word, monopoly. You see, acquisitions often leads to innovation, as two businesses that were once rivals see the combination of resources and knowledge. However, if one company uses acquisitions as a means of monopoly, there is a long-term negative impact on innovation. Whereas there is no competition left, the company finds themselves becoming lazy and see no true need to expend on innovation when consumers have no choice but to purchase from them. And that laziness did begin to show itself. From 1966 through until the early 70s, people were complaining about poor quality control within Fender instruments, in particular the Stratocaster, with some dealers even calling to complain about it. Quality control issues combined with more changes from the norm resulted in a guitar that is meant to be detested by guitarists the world over. The 1970s Fender Strats, the CBS era.
So, the 1970s Fender Stratocasters, controversial and widely regarded as bad quality. But, here's the question. Are 1970s Fender Stratocasters really as bad as players make them out to be? Well, to look into this in more detail, we must traverse the dimensional planes.
This is going to need a wild soundtrack.
Ah, the 1970s, the decade of all time. A time of wood vinyl, the colour orange, and someone thinking that the Reliant Robin was a good idea. But we're not here to test drive a three-wheeler. We're here to answer the question, what is up with Fender Strats of the 1970s? Well, to talk about this, let's talk about failure. You see, statistically, 70 to 90% of mergers and acquisitions are classed as a failure. But first we must consider what constitutes a failure for a business. A merger or an acquisition would be deemed as a failure if the expected benefits from the acquisition are not what was originally expected, if the acquisition damages the reputation of the business, and whether the quality and innovation that came from the large acquisition met the large investment. In terms of the CBS acquisition of Fender, this definition of a failure would apply. It was a failure. But how was it a failure, and how could this damage the reputation of Fender? It's very simple. Two very distinct aspects: poor quality control and cost-cutting measures. So what are these differences that people have identified that they class as problems in 1970s Fender Stratocasters? Well, you have the headstock, the bullet truss rod, the pickups, the body, and the 3-bolt neck plate. All of these have been reported by players and dealers to have either quality control issues or be an after effect of cost-cutting measures. However, upon examination of some of these parts, you actually begin to notice that though they are different to the traditional Strat, these are not exactly cost-cutting measures. A great example of Fender in its heyday using cost-cutting measures can be seen in 1958's version of the Telecaster. You see, 58 Telecasters are no different to regular Telecasters, but with the minor exception that is a top-loader bridge, meaning the strings are fed through the top of the bridge instead of through the body as per the usual. This change was not really welcomed by guitarists at the time, and as such, by 1959, the Tele was reverted back to a through-body loader. However, Fender had a problem. They still had a lot of these top-loader bridges to use. So instead of making new through-body bridges or just using up the last of the top-loader bridges, they just drilled holes in the top-loader bridges, giving guitarists the option if they wanted to top-load, but was still reverted back to the traditional through-body string-up system. So, cost-cutting measures are not exactly new to Fender, but we must also remind ourselves that this isn't Fender anymore. This is owned by CBS. One of these issues that guitarists have brought up is the 3-bolt neck, which is seen as a cost-cutting measure to save money on a bit of metal and 1 bolt. However, upon closer examination, the 3-bolt neck system is actually a bit of an innovation in this guitar. The 3-bolt neck actually featured a neck tilt system, allowing guitarists to adjust the height of the neck to better match the strings, and this was not featured on previous Fender Stratocasters, so this feature can be seen as a big innovation. Another change was the truss rod, known as the bullet truss rod by the 1970s because the top of the truss rod looks like a bullet. Instead of guitarists having to take off the neck from their pre-CBS Strats to adjust the truss rod, they can now adjust the truss rod from the top of the neck without even having to disassemble their guitar. This feature would actually go on to be used quite heavily in most other guitars, and was already a feature on most Gibson models before this. So that's 2 innovations for the 1970s Fender Stratocasters. So, where's this quality control issue? A lot of these quality control issues mainly revolve around the body of the guitar. The bodies were made from heavier cuts of alder, which compared to older Fender Stratocasters, usually lighter woods were more desired by guitarists. It is also reported that the neck pockets on these were routed too big, meaning the neck would wobble, resulting in the guitar detuning itself. And lastly came with the pickups. The pickups usually are wound to a specific position on the body, either a neck, middle, or bridge pickup. But with 1970s Fender Stratocasters, it was reported that a lot of the pickups were just put in a bin and placed in these guitars in a random order. There was no specific neck, middle, or bridge pickups anymore. They were just any random pickup to go in any random slot. So, these quality control issues were becoming a bit of a problem, and really tarnishing the reputation of Fender as a guitar builder. But this comes back yet again to that word, monopoly. Obviously, only Fender can make Fender Stratocasters. So, what would this mean to someone who wanted a Fender Stratocaster in the 1970s?
So, it's the 1970s. Rock is big, and I mean very big. It is the most popular genre on the planet, a very guitar-heavy genre. And let's say you are a new budding guitar player in the 1970s, and you want to play guitar, and you've seen Jimi Hendrix or Eric Clapton play a Fender Stratocaster. How do you get a Fender Stratocaster?
From what I understand, distribution of Fender into the UK in the very early days was largely via a distributor / retailer that they had in the West End of London. So I think you're talking about a period where most of the imported American product that came into the UK rarely made it out of Denmark Street in London, which is why Denmark Street became such an iconic location for musicians to go at that time. Certainly by the early 70s, you'd have started to see us perhaps a more familiar distribution of Fender products. So, you know, that there would have been enough product being made now and a mature enough sort of distribution network for music stores all over the UK to be able to buy Fender product.
Well, you have a few options. Number one, you can buy it new.
Buying new in the 1970s would have been fairly simple. You could go to a guitar store and buy one off the rack, or even ordered one directly from Fender. However, the issue with buying new were they were very expensive guitars. In today's money, being over £2,000 brand new off the shelf. Fender did make cheaper student models, for instance the Mustang, but they didn't make a cheaper Stratocaster. Even at this point in history, Fender Strats were still viewed as the professional's guitar. You do not buy one if you're a student or merely just looking to play it on the sofa. You buy it because you are a touring or session musician. You are a professional and you have that money to buy one.
One of the reasons why the guitar business is so big nowadays compared to 30 or 40 years ago, because the average player doesn't have just one guitar. You know, the average player has 5 guitars or 10 guitars. You know, it's just like, how many guitars you got?
Well, looking next to me, I've got 2, 3, 4. I've got 7 there. I've got an Epiphone on a stand over there, and I think I've got 3 in the back room.
Which,
sorry,
and honestly, man, like when I first started selling guitars, you'd have to be like a famous professional to own that many guitars.
So, unless you had very rich parents or you were Richie Blackmore in the 1970s, good luck trying to buy a brand new Fender Stratocaster.
So if you can't buy it new, you buy used.
By the 1970s, buying a used Fender Stratocaster was a very valid option. They were usually available in second-hand shops and newspaper advertisements. A used Fender Stratocaster would usually go for fractions the price of a brand spanking new one in the 1970s, and was the popular option for people wanting to play a Fender Stratocaster, as well as the popular option for a lot of famous musicians. Famous guitar players like Eric Clapton, Stevie Ray Vaughan, or even Mark Knopfler famously bought their Stratocasters used. The option to buy used was also becoming extremely popular due to the nature of Stratocasters at the time. They were expensive, but also had quality control issues that were quite well known. So, a lot of guitar players began seeking out 1950s and 60s spec guitars, mainly because they were the guitars preferred by famous musicians at the time. But, just like buying new, buying used also came with its own slew of issues. Buying used entirely relied on luck, that the model that you were looking for would be available in a second-hand shop or in a newspaper advert. So despite it being the cheaper option for a better quality guitar, it was also a very unreliable option, entirely reliant on whether someone wants to sell theirs.
Okay, so if you can't buy new, but you can't buy used, how do you buy a Fender Strat? It's very simple. You don't. You buy a copy.
Despite CBS owning Fender, and as such owning the Stratocaster, a strange phenomenon occurred in the 1970s. The Stratocaster was now in competition with the Stratocaster?
I'm escaping to the one place that hasn't been corrupted by capitalism.
East Asia. So, looking at the market of the 1970s for a Stratocaster, your options were extremely expensive but not exactly well-made guitar, or cheaper, more reliable, better built guitar, but without the reliability of being able to get one. There was a market of people who wanted a Stratocaster for a cheap price and a reliable build quality. But where on earth are we going to get something like that? Well, let me tell you. In the 1970s, you could get something like this from a catalogue. You see, cheap Stratocasters might not have been a thing, but cheap electric guitars have been a thing since the 1950s. By going to any department store at the time, you could have bought an Airline, a Supro, a Danelectro. Guitars made as cheap as possible for absolute beginner guitarists. But these guitars were still made in America, but they used things like plastic for the bodies. Humbucker looking pickups weren't actual humbuckers, but were just regular coils in the enclosure of a humbucker. These guitars, however, were cheap and mass-produced, and you could pick one up for a fraction of the cost of a new Fender Stratocaster at the time, and better yet, you bought it brand new. But as I said, these guitars were still made in America, so the cost of materials might have been low, but you still had to pay for the cost of labor in America. So the only way to make these guitars even somewhat cheaper is to somehow cut down on the labor costs. But there's a set amount that you have to pay if you're going to have it manufactured in America, so how on earth are you going to cut down on labor costs and still get the same quality of guitar?
Outsourcing your manufacturing.
Around the same time, we also begin to see brands like Kay or Teisco show up in department stores and even in guitar stores. These guitars were built using proper traditional guitar manufacturing processes, such as something as simple as using wood, something that the American manufactured ones weren't using. But the shocker of all of this is the fact that these guitars were usually better built and cheaper to not just manufacture, but sell at a markup price. So, in the 1970s, there were guitar manufacturers in Japan, Korea, Indonesia, China, that are hearing that over in America and in the United Kingdom, people are after Stratocasters, but they simply can't afford them. What would follow this would become known as the lawsuit era.
Well-documented period of ownership under the CBS brand where during the 70s they'd just gone for sales and quantity and sacrificed quality, and I think that enabled lots of brands to come out of the woodwork basically making Fender copies.
Instrument manufacturers, mainly in Japan, began making almost exact replicas of Fender Stratocasters. They would use similar woods, they would use similar electronics, even similar building techniques to essentially create exact replicas of 1950s, 1960s, and on the odd occasion 1970s spec Fender Stratocasters almost to a T. Better yet, the cost of materials, the cost of labor were also a lot cheaper with it being abroad, meaning these guitars could be sold for a profit and markup and still be cheap enough for a beginner guitar player or even just an average Joe guitar player to come and buy one. Now, as you can imagine, this presented a big problem for Fender, because it wasn't even just the Stratocaster that these people were copying.
So, you might remember earlier I showed you this Telecaster. It looks like a Fender Telecaster. It plays like a Fender Telecaster. In almost every detail, it's a Fender Telecaster. But then you look at the headstock. This is a Tele copy.
They were copying Telecasters, they were copying their bass models, they were even copying their niche guitar models like the Mustang, Jazzmaster, and Jaguar. Fender wasn't the only company suffering from this either. Gibson were also suffering the same fate, with these same manufacturers making replicas of Les Pauls, SGs, even some of their ES models. With sales dropping and this huge issue weighing on Fender's shoulders, how do you think they went about solving it? Well, the answer was very simple. They bought into it. The solution was actually simpler than you think. You see, when you think of a Fender guitar, you think the Fender guitar was made in the Fender factory and then was bought by a guitar store to be sold as a Fender guitar. It's a fairly linear and straightforward idea. But the guitars coming out of Japan were manufactured slightly differently. You see, these guitars were usually made in the same factories and then were sent over to guitar stores or department stores and then given their own unique name. Reason you'll see so many of the same looking guitar, but it's got a different brand on the headstock. That's how it happens. One such of these factories was a factory called Fizhy, which Fender would acquire by the start of the 1980s. The Fizhy factory by 1981 would begin manufacturing the Squier guitars, named after the company that Fender had acquired in 1963. Because of cheap labor costs as well as the cheaper cost of the exact same materials over in Japan, the Squier guitars became a success and were favoured by guitarists for quite a while. With Fender buying Fizhy, this also allowed them to buy themselves into the Japanese guitar market, which at the time was primarily dominated by these copy guitars under brands like Fernandez, Greco and Tokai. But at last, with buying this factory and manufacturing these guitars in Japan, Fender had finally made a cheaper, reliably built Fender Stratocaster for the market. In the decades following the 1980s, Fender went from the brand that only primarily focused on the most professional musicians to focusing on musicians from all walks of life, from absolute beginner to still the most professional. But this leads to a whole new series of questions. What did Fender learn from this difficult period in the 1970s and 80s? How have they diversified their price ranges so every type of musician could theoretically afford a Fender Stratocaster? And how does the business model of Fender today compare to Fender's business model back in the day? Fender today now consists of 4 separate points of manufacture: Squier, Fender Mexico, Fender Japan, and Fender USA. Squiers today are manufactured in a multitude of factories located in China and Indonesia. Squiers still to this day operate as the budget guitars of the Fender catalogue. A beginner guitar player or someone simply on a budget could pick up a Fender licensed guitar for as little as £129 today. Now, however, Squier offers a multitude of different guitars with different specifications to fulfill the needs of any guitar player on a budget. They offer cheap but reliably built guitars perfect for beginner guitarists. A standard range, a range of guitars that are essentially the same models but with modern updates that are more for the more experienced guitar player, but still on a budget. Squier even offer a range called the Classic Vibe, which is essentially a range of budget guitars, however spec'd closer to 1950s, 60s and 70s Fender guitars. They even offer a contemporary range, a range of guitars with different pickup configurations, different hardware, finishes, or even different positionings of pickups, and even experimental models. These can range from guitars that people might want because they want something a little bit different, a little bit against the grain, to guitars that are built for genres like metal. You'll find this business model with all of the Fender manufacturers across the world. They will typically offer a standard range, a series of the most famous Fender models from across the years with modern day appointments, a vintage range which is intended to replicate guitars of the 1950s, 60s and 70s in terms of specifications, and contemporary models, usually designed to meet the specifications of specific genres or even just allow Fender to experiment from within that factory. For instance, Fender Mexico has the Fender Player, the Fender Player Plus, and the Fender Vintera range, and Fender USA offering the American Professional, American Ultra, and American Vintage series. Despite all of these different places of manufacture offering the exact same range of guitars but at different price points, each one offers a unique series or take on these guitars. Fender Mexico, for instance, offers the Artist series, essentially a range of guitars designed to replicate the specifications or the guitar used by a specific artist, or as we know them normally, signature models. Fender Japan usually experimenting with their Hybrid series, taking these vintage spec guitars but then giving them modern appointments such as a humbucker in the bridge, or maybe a different tremolo system. And then of course Fender USA offer the Custom Shop, an opportunity for guitar players to have a guitar made by Fender, custom made to their own specifications. Today, Fender now sells the Fender Stratocaster in all of these ranges in its standard form, and you can buy a Fender Stratocaster now from as little as £129, as I said, to all the way up in the 4-figure range. But what if you're different? What if you don't want one of these new guitars that Fender is selling? What if you're thinking to yourself, no, I don't want one of these brand new guitars. No, I want a used guitar. More specifically, a vintage used guitar. I'm going to go online right now and I'm going to buy a used vintage guitar because if it's good enough for Eric Clapton, it's good enough for me.
That sounds very good to me. Yeah, let's have a look at that. Oh my. What an expensive price.
So we know about Fender's new guitar price, its effect on the market and the market that it holds. But what about old Fenders? Old Fender Stratocasters? I mean, they're cool. A lot of guitar players still want them, still use them. That's the reason Fender still make vintage spec series of them. But what if today you wanted to buy a vintage Fender Stratocaster, vintage being around 1954 through to 1981? Thankfully, there is a brilliant website that gives you the very opportunity to buy your own vintage Fender Stratocaster, but gives me the opportunity to see the data of other people's opportunities. What is this website?
Reverb.
Established in 2013, Reverb is essentially like eBay, but specifically for musical instruments, and has a very vast guitar market on it. You could buy brand spanking new guitars on there, or you can buy other people's used guitars. But thankfully, Reverb also has a brilliant range of vintage guitars for sale on there, including Fender Stratocasters. But what Reverb has for me right now is data. On Reverb, if you were to look at, say, a specific year of a Fender Stratocaster, I can see how much someone's paid for it, when they paid for it, and there is a backlog of this all the way back to the website's founding. Using this data, I can find out which years of Fender Stratocasters are the most popular, which ones sell the most often, how much they sell for, what's the highest priced ones, what's the lowest priced ones. And in using this data, we can actually find out how vintage Fender Stratocasters do on today's guitar market. So, After literal hours of sifting through a lot of numbers, what are the findings of my data? Now do keep in mind that these are all organised in year of manufacture of these Fender Stratocasters. So the findings of my data definitely showed some stuff I was to expect, but definitely some very unexpected things. So let's start off with a pretty obvious one here. This is the data for the current minimum sale price of vintage Fender Stratocasters on Reverb. And, well, as to be expected, the 1955 Fender Stratocaster, one of the earliest manufactured ones, is the most expensive, with the cheapest ones currently being
Those dreaded 1970s Fender Stratocasters.
And then here is the current maximum sale price of the vintage Fender Stratocasters, and we see a similar trend to the minimum prices, though do ignore 1958 as I couldn't get the data for that one. That's a bit of an outlier. Now here's a very interesting bit of data that I found. The amount of these vintage Fender Stratocasters that have actually sold on Reverb over the years. So as you can see, there's not many 50s, not many 60s, though it does start going up a little bit around 62. Oh my god! Wait, what? Yep, you're not dreaming, you're not imagining things. This is the data that I got. And what it shows me is that the most popular models for sale on Reverb that have sold the most are those dreaded 1970s Fender Stratocasters. This pattern is also reflected in the amount of them up for sale. So, what's going on here? Well, to answer that, let's look at this next figure. This is the earliest and latest purchase prices of the Fender Stratocasters. Essentially, what was the earliest known sale price of one of these guitars, and what is the latest known sale price of these guitars. Now this graph not only shows us the economic inflation of 10 years, but it also shows us that the price of 1970s Fender Stratocasters has stayed almost the same in 10 years. As such, we can reasonably deduce that because of the shockingly low price that 70s Fender Strats have maintained over 10 years of sales has also resulted in the biggest amount of sales. This does make some sense, however. Famous guitar players throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, even the 2010s have preferred and played 1950s and 1960s spec Stratocasters. As such, vintage guitar dealers will raise the price purely because of the association with these guys. But the issue is the price is now raised to such a point that it is not a viable option for musicians anymore, but purely for the collector's market. As such, leaving the 1970s Fender Stratocasters essentially in the bargain bin, meaning more and more people who are looking to buy a Fender Stratocaster, specifically a vintage Fender Stratocaster, are now looking to the 70s ones. Little would we know that the failure of the CBS acquisition of Fender would result in the biggest boom of their guitars in the 21st century, in the 2010s through to the 2020s. So now we know about Fender's place in both the new and vintage guitar markets of today. But what about who those markets serve? Now, in your typical Fender Stratocaster documentary, you would expect me to now cut to an interview with a famous guitar player. Ladies and gentlemen, here's Mark Knopfler. I'm kidding. We couldn't afford Mark Knopfler. But I don't want to focus on the incredibly famous musicians who already have their own signature model and probably contributed to the price inflation of 1950s and 60s Fender Stratocasters. I want to focus on the guitar players of today. From beginner to intermediate to expert to hell, even professional musicians. I want to know what the Fender Stratocaster means to them and what they mean for the future of Fender Stratocasters.
No worries.
I've got you on full volume, so you should be fine.
Excellent. Do you need to see my guitar? It's right here.
Yeah, I'll take a screenshot of it.
Let me hold it.
Yeah, let me get the screenshot of it. Yeah, there it is. I remember that Strat. Do you still have your white one? Or do you get rid of that one?
No, it's right here.
Yeah.
It's broke, but not just for it's a Squire, so...
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, just for the recording's sake, I'm showing you the Olly's Stratocasters.
Yeah.
So that one is the Fender Noir.
Crafty little buggers, noir, black, Spanish, yeah.
Yeah. Made in Mexico, and I think he said he paid about £500 for that.
500?
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't look bad, so I'd pay 500 for it as well.
My name is Olly Jacques, and I produce in my spare time. Produce music, metal music, more so, but that's what I do.
Hi, my name is Reese, and I've only been learning guitar for a few months now.
Do you own any Stratocasters? If so, tell me about them.
I do. I own two. I own a Fender Strat. It's a Noir. It's really nice. It's the usual Strat sort of setup, but it's a Mexican Strat. Really nice to play. And then I've also got a Squire, which has got sort of like a rip-off Squire EMGs in it, set up with the Floyd Rose on top of it.
I haven't, but I have lent one from school, and I'm planning on buying one.
Okay. Do you know anything about that Strat?
Stratocaster. I don't remember a lot about it or the model it is, but it was really good. It had had a lot of different settings on it, so you could play different types of music, like rock or metal. It was really great.
For you, how accessible is buying a Fender Stratocaster?
Very. I see them in pretty much every guitar shop. If there's not just acoustics there's probably a Fender Strat there, to be honest. Either that or some kind of rip-off make of a Strat, which is just as good, especially if you're a beginner. They're great. Fender Strats, you get the high-end ones as well in more of the big branded shops like PMT, Dawson's, all that. You see them everywhere. They're very popular.
I'd say very accessible for beginners, especially because I primarily wanted to stick to rock, but if I ever felt like branching out to try and play a metal riff, I could learn to do that because I'd have the ability to change the setting on the guitar or use a different type of amp for it.
What are your typical preferred guitar specs, and does your Strat meet your needs?
My Strat meets... Let me try that again. My Strat does meet my needs. It has pretty much everything. It's got the usual pickups in it, and solid bridge on it. No, it's got a trem hole there, but I never really use it. So it's just solid state bridge. Truss rod in the actual neck. It's brilliant. Meets my needs as a standard Strat. The other Strat is a different story because it's sort of like a wacky Strat with a Floyd Rose on it, EMGs. But because I love the Strat shape, it's perfect for when I want to do more metal-y stuff on a different kind of, same build, basically. I like it. It's different.
Couldn't tell you because, again, I've only been playing for a few months. But as time progresses, I probably would want it to have a certain sound I would want it to meet, but right now I don't really mind.
Have you ever modded them or felt the need to mod them?
Honestly, no, because I have that second one. Because that second one is pretty much a souped up Strat to a degree. At the moment it's broken, but I'm working. Maybe because it's broken, I would soup it up a bit. It's been a consideration. Also, that one isn't as expensive, so I wouldn't mind doing that to not such a high-end guitar, like a Strat guitar. But the first one, which is about 500 quid, I wouldn't touch. That I like that one a lot.
Fair enough. Very fair.
Yes, I would. I wouldn't know how to, so I'd have to probably either ask you for help or try and look it up online, but I absolutely would.
Do you feel that Fender today appeals to your playing style and specs?
Yes and no, because I'm more of a metal musician. I don't feel like you can't play metal on a Stratocaster, but I feel like it depends what you go for as a Strat build, because the pickups on the first Strat, the black one, the Mexican one, they appeal more to, because they're so clean, they appeal more to like the blues kind of playing style, kind of classic rock, which is nothing wrong with that. It's great and it's very comfortable. But if I wanted to go any heavier, say, I've got 7 strings and things that I've got Fluence Fishman kind of pickups in. It's nothing like that. It's nothing like that. So you can't go as heavy as that, but say, like, souping it up if you wanted to, whacking a couple of EMGs in, it would be able to do what you'd want it to do. But as buying it standard like that, probably not.
I'd say yes for the one that I have played. Yeah. I'd say yes.
Do you feel that Fenders are overpriced? Ranging from the Squire to the Fender range.
Okay, yeah. Honestly, from a Squire aspect, a beginner could pick up a Squire for about $250, which I think is a decent price for a starter guitar. If you want a good starter guitar that's not going to, drive you around the bend with probably very high action and things that need setting up because it feels a bit tacky. But Fenders can range into the thousands, but that's more for the sort of experienced player that really has like certain needs to be met and they like certain specifics on them, certain specs, and yeah, it depends. Also color and style of a guitar, sort of, you take that into account when you're looking at high-end guitars.
Yeah. Oh no.
Oh no, what?
Gosh. Sorry.
Yes, but that's all guitars. Let's be real. You're gonna have a guitar that's overly priced, and some might not be, but that's just how it's always been.
So with all of the different Strat copies of S-type guitars being like very popular, does it matter what's on the headstock?
I suppose a lot of people would like it to say Fender Strat on it, with a little trademark and all that. It's very branded. I think what matters more is the code at the back that tells you how authentic it is, depending on how much you paid for it. But if you're someone who likes to customize their guitar, even spray paint it, I guess it doesn't really matter, because some people aren't fussed. It depends on the person, really.
No, because if I'm buying it brand new, as long as it comes to me not broken in half, missing all of its strings, and the neck just completely broken, doesn't really matter. Because at the end of the day, you're getting a Stratocaster, you might as well use it. If it's bad, then it's like, why? Then go to the main company. I'll buy it from there. At the end of the day, it's still the same guitar.
If the option was available to you, do you think it would be worth buying a vintage Fender Stratocaster?
Are you on about the relic ones that are scratched up?
No, I'm talking like true 1961 or 57s. So like, just like, if the option was available, would you?
If I was financially, able to do that, probably. That would be very nice. But I feel like a lot of those are quite high end, which does throw a lot of people off of them. Me personally, I'm quite happy with mine. If I wanted to treat myself, yeah, because you can't have enough guitars as a guitarist. But for now, I have other guitars in mind that I much prefer, and I really like my Strat. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It's great.
No, not at the beginning. If I was playing for around 2 years, I'd say, and I was really interested in getting more expensive ones, then I absolutely would. Or if I've decided I want to stick to not putting like extremes amount of money in it, then I wouldn't. It depends on how I feel and how far I want to take it.
something to aspire to.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, brilliant.
Do you say Fender are quality instrument makers today?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you could, I have a Gibson SG, and that's great. But any other Gibson guitar, I can't really stand, to be honest. That it's either taste or I don't know. I just feel like their quality of guitars are sort of slacking compared to Fender. I think Fender are always on top of their game, and they've got Squier to sort of put out the sort of cheaper end guitars. Fender's sort of made throughout America as well as Southern America. It's one of those. I just think Fender are a bit more quality than Gibson, and those are the sort of two that kind of take the two comparisons side by side. Yeah. I'd choose a Fender over a Gibson, put it that way.
Yes, absolutely. Especially with the design and how they feel. They don't feel too heavy nor too light, and the strings aren't really. They don't feel like pure, like you're trying to fight the guitar into playing. So I'd say they are absolutely good quality.
Would you say Fender has been an innovative company?
I'd say yes and no. They've obviously come a long way. They're still very relevant today. And they sort of sign on really good artists that are up and coming and things, sponsor them with their guitars and things. But they haven't changed much. But I suppose if you're saying innovative, then I don't know, they just haven't changed much, but I suppose they wouldn't need to. It's a great guitar as it was, and it still is, so it's what people want, and why would they change?
Yes, I would. Especially, what's it called? The Squiers have been kept being sold since the 50s.
Not Squiers.
Oh, Squiers. Which one's this then?
So, Fenders have been sold since the 50s.
Oh, Fenders.
Squiers, when they were made in Japan in the 80s.
Ah.
Yeah.
So, then, yeah, still the answer would be yes. I mean, they've branched out to other countries, and they're still big for such a long time. So, yeah, I'd absolutely say yes.
Would you say Fender today appeals to players of all backgrounds, and how would you say they compare to other guitar companies?
I'd say so. I haven't really heard anything of them not sort of appealing to anyone outside of anything, really. I see lots of different people with Fenders, Strats mainly. It's the big one. You got Telecasters as well, but Strats seem to be, the icon of Fender, and everyone knows what a Strat is when you look at it. It's the classic. Everyone wants a Strat when they first start playing. So it's what I wanted, but I didn't get one. I got a Yamaha. But it was in the Strat shape. It's iconic, and I think everyone really wants one, and it doesn't really matter. It appeals to everyone, so I think they do kind of appeal to everyone. Maybe that's on purpose, maybe it's not. I don't know.
And how would you say that compares to other companies?
Other companies, well, definitely you got the likes of Kiesel and Jackson. Jackson is kind of under Fender in a sense, but Jackson sort of appeals more to a metal player as well as Kiesel. You got Strandberg as well, which do headless guitars, and again, that's more modern guitarist sort of technical style playing. It's not really blues at all. You wouldn't really play blues on it. I mean, you can, but you wouldn't. Jackson as well. It's like trying to play metal on a Strat. Like, you can, but you'd choose something else.
Yeah.
I couldn't give you a definitive answer. You'd have to ask different people. Like I said, I wanted to primarily stick to rock before branching out to metal. Yeah. But I did have a mate who was doing a lot of like Metallica and Slipknot and all that. So if you got a yes from him who was trying to play metal and yes from me who playing rock, yeah.
So I mean, do you have anything at all to say extra about the Fender Strat?
It's just iconic, isn't it? Everyone wants one when they first start playing. I mean, you see Jimi Hendrix, the classic. He's got a Strat. They're brilliant. He obviously used it wrong, but made it right. So I guess with a Strat, you can't really go wrong. It's pretty good. I don't really have much of anything negative to say about a Stratocaster, which I think would have made this more interesting. But I really like them.
They're good quality. They're great for a beginner like me, and I'd absolutely buy one myself when I get the money and absolutely spend a lot of time learning it. It's great, especially as a new hobby, because you can start off low end, and if you really do get into it, you can start putting more and more money in. Instead of having to go, all right, I'm going to put a few thousand in, and it's like, oh, I just lost our money. You could start like 100 or less if you buy a used one. So absolutely, it's a great starting point.
Yep. So I'm Lee Anderton, and I'm the managing partner of Anderton's music company. So I'm a third generation sort of owner manager of the business now. So it was started in 1964. So celebrating our 60th anniversary this year. We sell musical instruments and professional audio equipment. Have since maybe 2000 had both a bricks and mortar retail business and also an online business, and then since sort of 2007, obviously a pretty well-known media side to the business as well, with all the YouTube and social stuff. We are now probably predominantly an online retailer, so about 90% of our sales come online. We turn over circa 60 million pounds a year and employ about 150 people.
So, how long has Anderton's been working with Fender or dealing Fenders?
It's difficult for me to be terribly accurate with what it was like in the 60s, obviously, because I joined the business in 1989. But I would still probably say my earliest recollections of Fender when I started were, the range was still fairly limited. There would have been a Squire model if you were shopping for your first guitar. There would have been some early Japanese and Asian models in that sort of next level up, and then the Fender American offering was, I think now pretty much that was it. You bought a standard Strat or a standard Tele. I think when I first started, they probably just released that sort of Strat Plus variant, and then relatively shortly after I started, they opened the Mexican plant in Ensenada. But it's pretty unrecognizable. Fender's ranging now is really designed so that whatever budget you have got, from sort of £99 through to probably somewhere around about the £2,500 to £3,500, £3,000 mark, almost every £100 there's just it's another range and another range and another range. And then beyond that, you go into custom shop, where of course it's not really a range as such, it's whatever you want it to be. When I first started, a retailer like Anderton's might have 10 or 20 Fender guitars hanging up. I think if you go back to the 60s, it was more like the Wayne's World thing, where if a music store had a Fender in the window, people would come from miles around to see it. Mm-hmm. So like I say, by the time you were into the 70s, it was a bit more normal, but you walk into a decent sized music store now and you'll probably see 200 Fenders hanging on the wall.
Sales wise, how popular would you say Stratocaster models are at your shop?
Well, Fender is the biggest guitar manufacturer in terms of units and dollars. Gibson are next, unsurprisingly, I suppose. And then there's quite a big gap, sort of third place is some distance behind. I think it would be someone like Paul Reed Smith. And then fourth place and beyond is again quite a big gap again. So I don't think you shouldn't underestimate just how much bigger Fender are than everyone else. You know, it's like, and they've really done a great job of seeing off anyone else making a Strat copy. Actually, funnily enough, I think during my time, it surprises me actually that the Telecaster versus the Stratocaster split is surprisingly even. I think the Stratocaster gets the glory because it's perhaps the aesthetically more attractive looking guitar. Yeah. But yeah, I mean the Telecaster punches. You know, it's not you know, some years the Tele will slightly outsell the Strat, other years the Strat will slightly outsell the Tele. But I think the Strat is the, you know, if you ask somebody to draw a Fender, that's what they're going to draw, right? In fairness, if you ask someone to draw an electric guitar, that's what they're going to draw. So that's how iconic it is. It just is this incredible enduring design. You know, I can't name another product. Maybe the watch business is has some similarity here, particularly with, you know, if you're talking about people that like maybe that more luxury end of watches. But you know, the Fender Stratocaster from 2024 is barely different to the one from 1954, which is crazy when you think about, you couldn't say that about any other product in life. You know, it's just mental.
So obviously there are now multiple brands who make S-type models, and I was wondering, do you think it matters to the customer what's on the headstock?
Yeah, I think you can, broadly speaking, split the customer. So there's a value end. Okay, so if you take a brand like Fender or Gibson or any well-known brand, there's an overhead inherent in running that brand that makes it difficult for them to really compete at the super low end value market. Yeah. So we, for example, do a lookalike Strat guitar for 99 quid under a brand called East Coast, our own brand, East Coast. And yeah, at that price point, it's just the Fender brand has too much of an overhead to really, for that price of guitar, to be interesting for them. I don't think the price goes up terribly. I mean, I think, you know, Squire in that sort of 150, 200 pound mark, and then anything above that does become the dominant Strat style, you know, selling guitar. The only brands that I think have sort of managed to nibble away at the edges of that have been the brands that have done a slightly more contemporary take on the Stratocaster. Okay. So if you went, you know, John Suhr, Ibanez, AZ, more recently, maybe some of the Sire stuff. But, you know, it's anybody that just goes head to head with Fender. So just like the body is the iconic, you know, curvy, contoured body. It's very traditional. It's like they just lose every time. So you have the brands that have done okay with an S-type guitar have been the ones that have probably tried to address some of the reasons why you might not like a Strat. You know, you might want a flatter radius fretboard or slightly hotter pickups or a different trem. You know, and they've done okay. And Fender, I think, have stuck to, you know, I think Fender do versions of the Strat that might have a different trem or a flatter fretboard or something, but fundamentally they'll never move away from what is a relatively traditional looking body shape, and that doesn't appeal to everybody. And so that's where I think some other brands get a little slice of the pie by just doing something a bit more modern looking that maybe Fender don't do.
Obviously, like you said, with Fender now doing Squire and Fender Mexico, Japan, US, and like obviously all of the other kind of S-type guitars.
Yeah.
What would you say today sells the best in your shop?
Well, like I say, I mean, Fender is such an enormous, they're making amps and pedals and guitars, electrics, acoustics, basses. It's a big billion-dollar business now. But I mean, it would ultimately, as I say, ebb and flow from one year to the next between the Strat and the Telecaster. I mean, they will be the two, by some distance, biggest, most popular shapes for Fender. In terms of which ranges, it's as you would expect. The cheaper the guitar gets, the more they sell. So Squier is a volume business, selling tens of thousands of guitars a month. And then Mexico will be the next most, and then America will be the next most, and then Custom Shop will be the least. But I'm talking about units here. In terms of dollars or pound notes, I don't know, it's probably a bit more even, in the sense of obviously selling less American guitars, but they're a higher price, so the total value of those sales probably isn't. Yeah, I mean, yeah, difficult. I've not been to any of I've not been out to the Far East to see any of the Squier factories or anything like that. But the Corona factory for American stuff and the Ensenada factory for Mexico stuff, they pump out a lot of guitars. When you are there, you just go, wow. Every day, hundreds and hundreds of people are buying a Fender Strat or a Telecaster from somewhere.
Obviously, this documentary has a huge focus on accessibility for all guitar players from all leases of life. So how accessible is it for a guitar player today to just walk into Anderton's and buy a Stratocaster?
I think if you just took the UK in isolation, we're obviously pretty lucky. The sort of minimum wage in the UK and the sort of average disposable income of someone in the UK, and we're incredibly lucky that nowadays 8 or 9 hours of minimum wage salary buys you a guitar. There are still billions of people on the planet where 8 or 9 weeks worth of minimum wage doesn't buy them a guitar. Yeah. So I think it's accessible to parts of the world.
Last question.
Yep.
Is why do you think players still want Stratocasters after 70 years?
It's just because Leo got it right. It can play any style of music. It's an incredibly reliable instrument. It's super affordable. It looks just $1 million. You couldn't, it's like, I do think to myself, there must have been something in the water in that golden decade of 50s, maybe going into the early 60s. I mean, just the Strat, the Tele, the Les Paul, the 335, the Jazzmaster, the Rickenbacker 4001, the Hummingbird. It's like, there's just like, it was like, there was a real beautiful age of product design, I think, during that time. I'm not talking about necessarily features and stuff. I just mean the form factor. They just nailed it. And I kind of feel like, in a way that no other, as much as other brands have been successful in Ibanez and ESP and all these other things, I don't think they're all successful because of their ergonomic functionality. They changed something to make a guitar faster to play or stay in tune better or be more versatile. But I don't think anybody made a guitar that looked nicer, has ever made a guitar. PRS maybe, but what is, I still get goosebumps just taking a red Squier Strat out the box. It's just stunning. It's hard to know, isn't it? I mean, I think there's probably a bigger question around, if you sort of went, well, what about another 50 years from now or another 70 years from now? And I think it'll be an interesting one as to, is the electric guitar likely to stay a dominant musical instrument within the music scene? Will we even be using instruments to create music? I kind of, I hope so. But I don't even hope so from any kind of sense of, I hope so that Anderton's is still here. I just mean I think it would be sad if if humankind just felt that it was easier and quicker to use technology to create music than it was to actually take the time to learn how to play something. But I don't know what will, I don't have a crystal ball, so I suppose I don't know. But I think it gives me some comfort that, even now, if you're the 14-year-old kid at school that plays guitar in the little school band, you are the coolest kid at school. But yes, I mean, if I was a betting man, I would say 20 years from now, the Strat will still be the most popular guitar, but who knows? Who knows?
And well, that was it. The history of the Fender Stratocaster, its effect on the markets and its effect on players. It is, to this day, the most successful guitar of all time. Thank you very much for watching the documentary. Goodbye.
I'm a time traveler. Lovely guitar here, mine.